very new, and I'm not offering something entirely new or entirely different. Rather, what I'm offering is a kind of synthesizing of several methods that we may have employed, but we may not have theorized as pedagogic mechanisms. My attempt will be to approach literature as it is, that is literature. Okay, so the first section, as I said, it's titled From 4 C's to 3 C's. And at the very beginning, I will go to the very preliminary stuff because we are talking about teaching literature. So I will like to kind of recapitulate at the same time check what we mean by literature and literary studies. So we will discuss, I will focus on 5 issues in literary study before I move into the 3 methods that we may employ in studying literature. So the first point is defining literature. Yes, one may recall Oscar Wilde, who once claimed that to define is to delimit. But again, we want to define literature because now we know that delimitation is a kind of strategic essentialism, which is particularly required when we approach a discipline, even in this age of boundary bending. So defining literature is tough chiefly because there are many debates around it. But defining literature as we mean it now is necessary. Because surely literature in the phrase scientific literature or literature in the phrase literature review is different from what we now consider as literature. So we should differentiate between literature as any written account and literature as creative writing. So in today's session, I would like to form, or we may form, a working definition of literature so that we, learners and teachers alike, know what we're studying. So since it's a workshop, I need to interact and accommodate you. But since we are running short of at least 12 minutes, so let me be talkative and let me keep talking instead of engaging you, because that may take some time. And in online, I mean, we understand that it's also difficult to engage people. So let me, instead of asking you, offer the definition. So if we think of this definition, rather a long definition, but we may make it easier in order to both to remember and underline the major definitions. Sorry, major points. So we may say that in this definition, we may locate 5 elements. That is, literature is primarily a verbal creative work. So instead of calling it creative writing, I would like to use verbal creative work. But when we are talking of verbal, we need to understand that it also involves non-verbal elements. For example, graphic novels. So what does it do? It conveys thoughts, feelings, and experiences, 3 separate kinds of experience. So by thoughts, I would like to cover everything like intellectuality and reasoning. Feelings cover the affect, and experience covers the actual lived experience, like events. How? Literature is a creative work that conveys thoughts and feelings in an engaging and innovative way. So here comes issues of creativity and also how it engages and attracts readers. Then comes without strong claim for factuality. Even historical novel, which is based on history, does not claim to be factual. And why it does so? Because it intends to bring pleasure and purpose to the reader's experience. If this is the definition, then we may locate several points that involves this definition. And I argue that all these things we need to address when we are studying literature, and all these things we need to address when we are teaching literature. Be it meaning teaching a course, or be it meaning forming a curriculum or a syllabus of literature. It is, however, equally important that we make our students and ourselves aware of the specificities of literature. That is what makes literature different from other verbal acts in the humanities. For example, an event of suicide can appear in a novel, can appear in a history book, and can appear as a news feature. Where lies the difference? What makes literature literature? So the difference is not necessarily in the content, rather in the philosophy and the process of representation. For example, history represents, unlike literature, history claims for factuality and objectivity. And we may like reading literature, but we may like reading history, but giving pleasure is not history's main purpose. Similarly, news also claims for factuality and objectivity, but like literature, news also wants to be engaging. But unlike literature, news does not claim for creativity in the sense that it is created. So what we need to do is be aware of and make students aware of the specificities and exclusive features of literature on the one hand, and second hand, how literature is related to other areas of study. The second, so the important point about literature is therefore literariness in the, I'm taking the word from appropriating formalist critics, that is the spatial use of language that makes literature literature. The second issue when we are talking about teaching literature is what does literary study means? So we can say that literary study is an academic discipline or academic practice which is devoted to the study of literatures and relevant language arts. Being a humanistic study, literary study has its focus on the study of production and reception of literary discourses, and it involves 4 areas. Our first area is conception. That is, it is chiefly about the nature and operation of literature. It involves the studies in the relation and interaction between the text and the world. So, for example, the poetics of mimesis, of representation, the questions of truth and factuality, and literary movements ranging from realism to magical realism. The second aspect is composition. It is about the relation and interaction between the text and the author, which includes studies on the imagination, on creativity, on expressivity and the depth of the author, on the affective and socio-political conditioning of the production of literary text. Third is consumption, and it involves studies on the interaction between the text and its audience, the reader. And this involves the studies on the ethical, aesthetic, and therapeutic impacts of literature, like catharsis, and also what we call interpretation. And the fourth area of study is construction, or what we call formalization. It is the interaction between internal and external literary elements in a text. So this involves the studies on genre and structure, studies on the lexical, acoustic dimensions of literature, on allusions and intertextuality. So when we approach a literary study, when, for example, take or offer a literary course, it is important that we are sure, and we also make students sure about what we are doing, what literary study involves. This somehow forms or conditions the methods and the approaches that we take in teaching literature. The third element in literary study is situating the literatures. So when we say literature, do we mean that it is a kind of universal phenomenon, that it is a homogeneous human act? It is important to underscore that there are literatures in plural. For example, when we say that literature communicates by word, probably we think of written literature only. But word also involves speech sounds, as we find in orature or a literature. Word involves letters, which is itself a visual sign, and that constitutes written literature. But there are languages that include word images, say Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese ideograms. So whichever form it takes, language is an integral element of literature. We have noted that it is different, or in Shklovsky's words, the spatial use of language that gives literariness to literature. It is therefore important that we mobilize our learners to concentrate on the verbal and the non-verbal modes of communication that a literary text employs. The another point is that when we are studying transcultural literature, for example, doing English literature in Bangladesh or in South Asia, it is crucial to underscore that literature and its genres like novels and poems are not considered the same way throughout the world. For example, Shahid in Bangla is more than simply an English translation of literature. So the word Shahid predated British and English imperialism. So Shahid is a kind of connection between things, that is Shohito. And therefore, we cannot claim that the perception of literature, perception of Shahid in South Asia is similar or the same as the perception of literature among the English. So this is something is important, that only because certain work of art, so there is no universal concept, there is no universal practice of literature. So what Aristotle considered as literature and literary might not apply to each and every work of Indian literature. Similarly, neither does our understanding of literature entirely fit African literature. Therefore, only because a certain work of art does not match our or Western notion of literature does not mean that those works of art are not literature. So when we study literatures in English, that is Anglophone literatures from England and Ireland, from the US and Australia, from Nigeria and Jamaica, from Pakistan and the Pacific, from Bangladesh, let us be alert to the fact that there is contingency. Let us be alert to the contingency of every act of literary evaluation. The fourth element, which is particularly important for our today's discussion, that is literary policy system. We must understand that a literary work does not operate or exist in isolation. A literary work informs and is informed by a literary system in which it is situated. So a literary system informs and involves, for example, a literary tradition, that is the history of national literature or the conventions of novel or conventions of sonnet in that particular national culture. It involves a socio-cultural framework, including languages, religions, etc. For example, literatures in minority languages are often marginalized, or a theme may not surface in a national literature if the dominant religion or the dominant cultural stance does not acknowledge that theme in that culture. Third, the literary system involves a legal institutional framework, for example, censorship, freedom, literacy, for example, the banning of Morrison's The Blue Sky. And literary system involves a network of literary activities. For example, if a book's involvement with a network of writers, publishers, critics, circulation chain, and the culture of review is stronger, the chance is high that that book will be well sold, well reviewed, and well known. So referencing Itamar Ibn Zohar, we can say that a literary work operates in a complex network of literary and other social, cultural, and political systems, and together they form literary policy system. What is more intriguing is to note that a national literary policy system is related to other or neighboring literary policy systems. For example, the connection between English and French literary policy systems, or the connection between Bangladeshi and English literary policy systems. So it is difficult to ascertain whether there exists a planetary literary policy system, but it is useful to keep in mind the explicit or implicit interaction between two or more literary policy systems when we attempt transcultural study of literature. In tune with this take, we can say that every piece of writing in one literary system, for example, English literary system, is somehow connected to other or neighboring literary systems. Similarly, every reading of another literature invokes a dialogue between the literary system in which the work was produced and the literary system in which the reader is in. This is the case when we in Bangladesh or South Asia read literatures in English. And the fifth point is the functions of literary study, that why we do literature. The functions vary depending on the way or on the objectives, on the agenda, why we are teaching and studying literature. In Bangladesh, we can say that studying of literature happens in two types of scenarios. One is the English studies classroom, and the another is EFL classroom, where literature is used to teach language. My focus today is on English studies classroom. And there are several functions. We know this, so I'm not going to discuss that to make the points. So the first set of function is that it relates to learning, using literature to learn a language and also how meanings are made. The second set of objectives include that is using literature to expand our knowledge, our ideas and understanding of the other. Third is a major objective that is developing informed and stronger appreciation of literature. The fourth is increasingly significant objective of studying literature to enhance our critical literacy and association skills. The fourth set of objectives includes activating imagination, creativity, and enhancing creative writing skills. But it goes without saying that in our bid to concentrate on the second, third, and fourth objectives, we often ignore the potential of using literature to learn language and also to use literature, of using literature to develop imagination and creative writing skills. What I argue that an informed plan of teaching literature can accommodate all these features may not be in every course, may not be in every year, but in the long run in the curriculum. So it is with a short survey of the 5 aspects that inform the study of literature. Let me offer a very brief survey. Again, we know this, I'm just listing a very brief survey of some existing methodological approaches to literary study before I offer some more contemporary approaches. One approach is literary approach. It is a formalist approach to literature that is studying literature as a distinct area and exploring the literariness of a text. There is another approach called language-based approach that takes literature as a means of acquisition of linguistic competence and stylistic awareness. Another approach is called cultural. It considers literature as a means of sharing cultural notions, and accordingly, this approach focuses on the cultural appropriacy of a text. Another approach is called reader-oriented approach. It has its focus on the reader's relation with the text. On the one hand, it is related to what Carter and Long dubbed personal growth model. That is, the major motivation to read literature arises from the ways readers are able to connect a text with the lived experiences. On the other, it involves social constructivist paradigm that considers every act of production and interpretation as a means of construction of reality. That is, every meaning is equally valid and relative. Another approach is critical literacy. It is invested with critical theories and critical pedagogy. This approach mobilizes learners to explore and to challenge the hierarchical structure of power. Next approach is comparative approach. It foregrounds a text's cultural dimension and concentrates on adaptation, post-processing, and reinvention of meanings by comparing a text with a text in another language or culture. So, and there are also attempts to synthesize 2 or more approaches to attain multiple objectives. We may call these approaches integrated and eclectic. It is with this very brief and quick survey in today's talk, in the next 30 minutes, what I will offer is the 3 C's. That is, taking cues from all these approaches and methods, I will take into account the teaching of English literature or the teaching of literatures in English in Bangladesh. So I will offer an approach and provide 3 methods and samples the same. So I dubbed the approach I employ today critical effective approach. By approach, I mean a set of assumptions about the nature of literature and the nature of the study of literature. To be precise, critical effective approach combines criticality and the effect. that it combines the act and spirit of reasoning, questioning, intellectuality, and transformation on the one hand. And on the other hand, it involves the affect, that is the network of emotion, sensuousness, engagement, and subjectivity. Taking cues from this approach, I will outline three methods of teaching literature. By method, I mean a series of procedures or activities which are used to teach literature, which is consistent with a theory or approach. Here, consistent with critical affective approach. And the three C's that I'm offering in brief are critical expressive method, creative performative method, and comparative method. So before we move further, let us recap because it's a kind of workshop. But again, we are now running short of time. So let us recap quickly what we did till now. So we tried to understand defining literature, and that is inextricably related to the methods and approaches that we adopt. So if this is what we suggest, so we may recall the definition of this. That is, this is the definition that we offered. The literature is primarily a verbal creative work that conveys thoughts, feelings, and experiences in an engaging and innovative way without strong claim for factuality in order to bring pleasure and purpose to the reader's experience. We tried to understand what the study of literature means, and it outlines the four C's, that is the conception. Is it working?
Yes, sir, it's working.
So that is the conception, composition, consumption, and construction of literature. And then we situate literature against some polysystem. And then we tried some pedagogies of literature. And we are now going to discuss in brief the three C's of teaching literature.